I love starting right on time. So let's hit it. And this is going to be a quick one. And just to remind people, there is going to be one at noon Pacific time today also with John Armstrong. So Uncle Pete, give us your thing.
Times.
Yep.
Morning. Well, as you can see on my screen, we've been playing with graphing and dashboards for a project, making pretty stuff. You know, it's kind of funny. 2 years ago, I would have said that I am not a pretty website developer. That ain't my cup of tea at all. But you know, I've been drug into that world kicking and screaming, and WebDev has kind of made me look good. I mean, you know, this isn't by any means an extraordinary site yet, but pretty attractive compared to what I was doing 2 years ago, that's for damn sure.
Yeah, looking pretty good.
And this is all standard WebDev graphing here. As you can see, the AAF menus popping up, letting you change the graphing and everything. The one thing that they did not have, if you played with WinDev, the progress bars have a really nice feature that lets you turn them into gauges, like you know, speedometers. And I've used that before in dashboards and Windows programs. Unfortunately, they have not given us that ability in WebDev. So we don't have a gauge control in WebDev. And just to get a little different graphic interest on the screen, we wanted to show the response rate in a gauge format. And since this site is at that initial stage of not making money, we didn't want to spend a ton of money on it. So we kind of poked around and looked to see what was out there free. And it doesn't take much Googling to find out there are a ton of JavaScript gauges out there. Now, for this, again, I wanted something simple. I wanted something free. So that meant that if I could, I wanted to avoid bringing in the whole jQuery and getting just outrageous. There are some really impressive ones out there, and at some point this site will probably have to move over to something like that for all the graphing, just to get us into that top notch of the market. But for right now, something simple is more than enough. And after doing it, I figured it'd be a good little primer into how to incorporate some JavaScript stuff into a WebDev project. So that's what we're going to do today, is show how I did this. So let's start with, where did this thing come from? JustGauge is the one I decided to pick on. As you see, here's some gauges that they've got on their demo page. The nice thing I liked about it was standalone. These are the only two libraries that you have to load up. It's, you know, so you don't have to load the whole jQuery or anything. In fact, this is the extent of the JavaScript code to put a gauge on a page. So that definitely attracted me. Again, you know, one of my things I was after here was a nice, simple implementation. I wasn't wanting to spend a lot of time on this.
That's crazy simple, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely. And, you know, the thing to understand is I am not a JavaScript programmer. I every once in a while I have to dabble in JavaScript, and when I do, I generally have 4 or 5 Google windows open and a lot of copying and pasting and tweaking until I get it to work. So, you know, that's my level of JavaScript knowledge. But the one thing I know about it is it sucks as a language. So how do we implement this in WebDev? Well, like I said, if you see on their page, they kind of give you a getting started, little quick primer. You got to include 2 JavaScript libraries in your header. You got to have a div tag, which is where the content of your gauge is going to go. And then you've got a script that actually builds the gauge with all the values of how you want to title it, what number you want to show on it, that sort of thing. So that's the 3 pieces to getting a gauge on the page. So how does all that translate to WebDev? Here's the page at design time. And as you see right here is where that gauge is. First step is, if we go into the page description, go to advanced, in the JavaScript tab, you'll see where I have included those 2 libraries. If we flip back over Rafi21 min.js, JustGauge 101 min.js, you'll see those are the same 2 libraries. When I downloaded that zip file from JustGauge, those 2 libraries were included in it. When I did an add and navigated over and clicked on these, it made a copy in my Teamology Web in the project web directory. So now when I publish the site, those files are going to go up to my site the same as everything else. And they're going to be there available to be linked in and used.
Oh man, they couldn't have made it easier.
Yeah, exactly. You can also use the add a web resource, which lets you do it by URL. Some JavaScript libraries are published out there on public sites. Instead of you downloading them and keeping a copy yourself, you point to their URL. The good part about that is that if that code gets updated, you automatically just get that update because you're using their copy. The bad side of that is you get their updates, which means they can break stuff on you. The other downside is you're making an external HTTP call to get that JavaScript library every time your page loads. So if their site's slowing down or any kind of issues like that, it's going to affect your page. So most of the time, I keep local copies of JavaScript libraries. I rarely use an external web URL for the JavaScript libraries. So that's all there is to the first 2 lines of code. Next is the div section. And if we look at theirs, you got the ID, which again, you see the ID down in the part that's building the gauge. That's what links this code to this code, because you can have multiple gauges on your screen. All you do is name each div section with a different ID, and that way you're referencing a different one. They use the class to define the width. We're going to do that slightly different in WebDev. First of all, how do we get a div section in WebDev at all? We do that by doing a creation and using the HTML control right here. And that's what this is. And you'll notice in the HTML part of that, I've got div ID, response rate, and then just closing the div. I don't define the width here because I don't need to, because my HTML control itself is going to contain this div. So the size of my HTML control, which as you see goes out to here, is that size that gauge is going to take up. Notice that the response rate static and the down from static are inside. They're overlaid. onto that HTML tag. And the reason why is if we look at that gauge on the screen, even though it's using that whole space, the way they define and build that gauge, it takes that big of a box because they've got their own title here, but I couldn't control the font the way I wanted, so instead of using their title, I put my own title in so I could match up my fonting, and then I did the subtitle underneath. And it just took me a little bit of experimenting, moving these around so that I got them overlaid where they looked good. You know, no big mystery there. So now we have our div. Last piece is the actual code, which is this code here. Okay, so how did I do that part? Well, for that, I actually created a global procedure called build gauge. The first thing to notice is this is actually a JavaScript procedure. WebDev lets us do JavaScript directly. All you do when you create a new browser procedure, right now it's in W language. If you click on that WL, it becomes JavaScript. So that's as simple as it is. And again, I'm not a JavaScript programmer, but I was able to tweak this code just a little bit. If you look at their documentation, there's a few additional properties that are available. So I'm using the font color and the minimum and maximum values. And then I'm passing in several parameters to this thing. We'll see that here in just a second. But if you look at this code and look at this code, it's not a lot different other than, you know, I'm passing in some parameters for these values here. Nothing extraordinary by any means. You know, I'm not a JavaScript programmer, and I was able to get this done. Nice thing about this is a global procedure, so this code only exists one place. I can call this from any page in my app and get and display a gauge as long as I've defined a div section, as we saw a second ago. So now the last piece is how do we run this thing? And that's where you get into that whole server versus browser mentality that we have to understand. The code that actually is doing all the calculations for response rate is in a class called dashboard. So all the calculations are really done over there. I just have to get the values. Well, because I'm touching databases and classes, that's stuff that you can only do in server code. You can't do that stuff in browser code. So in server code, I'm getting the response rate, I'm getting the response rate color. What that is I turn the, you know, if the response rate has gone up, the gauge is green. If the response rate has gone down, the gauge is red. So the class is making those determinations. As you see, there's really no logic in this page. All it's doing is giving the class some criteria on what date ranges and so forth to run. And then all those formulas and stuff are in the class. So, you know, my logic, you know, this is that prime example of presentation logic versus business logic are completely separate. So again, the problem here is we're on the server side, and to call that JavaScript function, we have to do that from the browser side because that is pure browser code. Can't be ran from the server. So the first thing we have to do is get that communication going between server and browser. And you've seen me do it time and time again, no different here. We use two hidden entry fields. response rate color, current response rate, right there. So these variables are really not variables, they are hidden entry fields. And the reason I'm doing that is I can update those from the server. And then if we come down to the onload, the browser function right here, it's calling that build gauge. Response rate is the gauge ID, which we defined in that div section. It's using those two variables we defined, current response rate and response rate color, which are really those hidden entry fields. And that's that power of, because it's an entry field, both the server and the browser code can reach into that memory space. And so that's all there is to running that function, passing it the parameters, and building that gauge. If I had 4 gauges on the screen, they would all have different IDs, and I would just have 4 calls to build gauge here. And one of the keys to understand here is that build gauge is a JavaScript function, right? This is W language code here. We are able to call JavaScript functions directly from W language code. It's pretty cool and powerful.
Oh, so, that's good, really good.
Yeah, so I'm able to stay in my comfort zone as much as possible. You know, and that's one of the key takeaways here is, you know, I'm the guy that's always saying stay in the box, stay in the box. You know, sometimes you have to go out of that box, but you know, I only went out of that box where I absolutely had to go out of that box. You know, I could have done a bunch of JavaScript and embedded it into the actual HTML source and got all kinds of crazy and stupid with it. But instead, the only piece of JavaScript code you see in this entire thing is that one function. Everything else is still native W language. So that's the presentation. I promised you it was going to be a short and quick one today. So any questions?
Any questions, anybody? The mics are all open if you want to do it, or type your questions on the chat down below. So when you were talking about the separation of presentation and business logic, can you go back there and show us that again?
Sure. All right, let's take a look at, first of all, I have a class called dashboard class. That's where all of this logic is contained, that goes out there and pulls up the data, does all the calculations for absolutely all these graphs. Let me get back over for a second so you can see. As you see, there is a lot of graphs, and there's logic for these thumbs ups and thumbs downs and the formatting, all kinds of stuff. And if we look at the code here, there's really not a lot of code other than actually populating the charts. And the reason why is this dashboard class is doing all the heavy lifting. First, I give it a date range, and then I tell it to load the data. And that goes out there, and we'll pop over to the class in a second. But that goes out there and loads up all the data. Then, like this current response rate is a property. And if we go over and look at the property in the class, response rate is current responses divided by current request times 100, rounded to 2 decimal places. So now if we look at current response is actually a local variable in here that when we loaded the TSI data, Actually, that's in this one. Current request, current responses, all got out of the data. But now that formula of how that response rate is calculated is done as a property right here. And what that means is we decide that current response rate needs to go out to 3 decimal places. All I do is change this property. We decide that response rate needs to exclude certain responses or some crazy thing like that. I can adjust this formula right here, and magically everything that uses response rate now reflects the new formula for how response rate is calculated. I don't have to go into, you're seeing my TSI dashboard here. I also have a CLI dashboard, and I'm going to have, before it's all over, 6 different dashboards. So if I didn't separate out my logic, I would have to go change response rate formulas on all of these different pages. By doing it in that class and separating the 2 pieces of logic out, there's one place to update that code.
Cool. Okay, Daniel has some questions. He says, edit fields is possible using JavaScript?
Again, that's way beyond the topic of this this webinar, and beyond the topic of my JavaScript abilities. I'm trying to imagine why I would need to edit a field from JavaScript. I'm sure it can be done for the simple fact that under the DOM model, all the fields are able to be referenced and so forth. But that's getting too far on the other side of the line for me. Until I have a specific need for that, I wouldn't dig deep into that one.
So what you're saying, that if there was somebody had to enter something like a zip code, it would be in a WebDev field that would feed the JavaScript if you needed it, right?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, and let's see, example of this site only Portuguese. Well, he gave us a link, and then he says how to make example using. Okay, so
yeah, it's all part of the same question. Yeah, and that's a jQuery example. And again, I'm sure that's doable, but beyond what I've done or had a need to do.
But you probably can use the basis of what you.
Java. Exactly. This is your primer into the basics of incorporating JavaScript, and you can take it as far as you want to take it. I know one of the keys, and I'll give you a hint. One of the keys is when you start doing stuff like what Daniel's talking about there, you have to come into your page description here, and on the Advanced tab, maybe it's not there. Maybe it's on project description, advanced. I don't see it. Have they moved it? There used to be something somewhere, and they may have moved it in 18, that basically tells it not to rename the fields. One of the problems that you have is you call the field edit customer name. When they translate all this to HTML, they call that T2. And that makes it very hard for you to write JavaScript code because you never know what the field names are. Somewhere there's a checkbox, And it used to be on this page, but I don't see it anymore, that says, don't do that, leave the field names alone. And when you do that, now in the HTML code, that field is referenced as edit customer name, and that lets you reference it via the DOM model as well, via JavaScript and so forth.
Chris says, think it's using a programming charter. You know, are you there? Uh-oh.
No, the programming charter is about prefixing variable names. That's something entirely different. That's here. That's the charter. That's prefixing field names. That's a little different. Than what I'm talking about.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, or you're looking for something else, you're looking for that check mark.
No, I was looking for that check mark. Ben and I were discussing it the other day, so not sure where they moved that thing off to, but
it ran off on
it's out there somewhere. Yeah, that's you know, new versions, new places.
Bummer. So you originally wrote this in 17?
No, this has always been in 18.
Okay. Cool. Very good. Thank you very much for sharing again. And if there's no other questions, we'll see you this afternoon with John Armstrong.
Very exciting.
Yeah. You're going to be there, right, Pete?
Yep.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a great Friday.
All right. Enjoy.